Hello and welcome to this videocast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, clearly when viewed from current times, current events, George Orwell's book 1984 was extraordinarily accurate and predictive of what was to come and what is happening now, and we've seen nothing yet. He was able to predict the rise of the Big Brother state. Of course, it's becoming more and more blatant all the time. He was able to predict the never-ending war, the war without end that we call the war on terror. How do you know when a war on terror is ended? You don't. So it's, in theory, never-ending. And he predicted telescreens, televisions that can film you in your own room, your own home. We call them smart TVs, and they're only Mark 1 of the telescreens. So it's very sensible to look at other things that are predicted and outlined in that book, 1984. And one is something called Newspeak. Orwell's Newspeak was to so change and transform the language that the words no longer existed to say anything in detail. The words no longer existed to criticize authority. And of course, as Orwell pointed out, when you destroy the language, when you destroy words so that you cannot speak in a way that expresses your thoughts, then as the generations pass, that also stops you even thinking in detail. Because on one level, when we think in words. If those words don't exist to express your own thoughts, now you can't even think in detail, never mind express yourself in detail. And so, as with Big Brother, as with the never-ending war, as with the telescreens, so we have Newspeak, and it's called political correctness. And if you align that with text speak, you can see how the language is changing. You can see how words are being destroyed. You can see how the right to say certain words and phrases of words is being destroyed. And it is, just like Big Brother, just like the telescreens, just like the never-ending war, it is systematically engineered to be like that. The road to current day political correctness, brackets, insanity and madness, is not only not over yet, because they've not completed the job, but it actually started a long time ago. I've shown in my books how social engineering fronts, like the Frankfurt School, going back to the first part of the 20th century, had political correctness and the Orwellian Newspeak words destruction in their sights all those decades ago. And what we're seeing now is an explosion of political correctness and imposed Newspeak in colleges and universities, well, in society in general, but certainly in colleges and universities across the world, not least in North America and Britain. And the sad thing is, and the chilling thing is, that this is not being directly imposed upon people by the authorities, but by students upon students. So where once universities were places of radical thought and radical campaigning, now they are places where people are prepared for the adult world that's coming of newspeak and political correctness, even compared with now, on steroids. And the people who have bought this political correctness scam, this social engineering, are so childlike, so naive, so arrogant and up their own arse that they cannot see, as they go about their business of condemnation and character assassination and onslaughts of abuse against people who have allegedly broken the code of political correctness. They cannot see, when they're doing that they're just tools of the very state that many of them claim to oppose. We have more and more labels that make people perceive themselves in smaller and smaller ways. We are infinite awareness having an experience as what we call a human. And if you perceive yourself only to be human and not consciousness having an experience as a human, you've already diminished yourself in terms of self-identity. But what's happening now, absolutely systematically, is the human is being subdivided into endless categories, all of which have to be defended by political correctness from any criticism or any comment that could possibly upset people. And this whole arena that's so fast emerging of what people call safe space and the right not to be upset is all part of this destruction of A, the language, and B, freedom of expression. You cannot say anything that won't upset someone. So once you have this situation where you can't say anything that might upset anyone, you're closing in on the situation where you can't say anything. And this is what's happening. But these idiots, these thought police that police the language and police opinion on the basis of what they find acceptable, the arrogance of it, the tyranny of it. These people, some will know, most of them, are so stupid, so clueless, so self-absorbed that they won't see that they're just pawns in a game that they don't understand. So we have a situation where you say something quite mild and you're racist. You say something quite mild and you are homophobic, or you're transgender phobic, or whatever the latest bloody politically correct label is. And you get a situation where we've got this boxer, Tyson Fury, just won the world championship. And he's come out with From my perspective, ludicrous statements about the role of women, ludicrous statements about gays, etc., etc. But he's a boxer, he's a sportsman. He's not a politician changing the law. And what anyone with any kind of balance and perspective would say when someone said to them, have you seen what that Tyson Fury said? He said this about women, he said this about gays. And you go, idiot. What are we going to do this weekend? You get on with your life. Just an idiot. Who has a right to be an idiot, by the way. It's called freedom. But we mustn't upset anybody. In other words, we mustn't say anything worth hearing, whether it's nonsense by Tyson Fury or whether it's serious stuff that needs to be heard, that it's exposing the global tyranny. It's all part of this silencing of anything beyond the myopic norm that's acceptable to the state. And we have this political correct insanity that's reached the stage now where some of its high-profile advocates are saying this: everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point this all out. But if you point out that that is blatant freaking nonsense, then you're being politically incorrect. Do you know, there's a fella in Canada who's now facing a possible jail sentence for challenging the views of some feminists on social media. This is where it's going, and this is the point. This whole thing about feminism and homophobia and all this stuff, the people actually behind political correctness couldn't give a damn about women. That's the force that's been suppressing women all these years and decades and centuries. They could care less about gay people and their rights. Could care less about any of this stuff that political correctness is supposed to be about, because that's not what it's really about. It's about using these things to push humanity along the road to newspeak and the end of any opinion that does not suit the state. The other thing about political correctness and its tyrannical advocates and imposers is that they can say what the hell they like and it can't be politically incorrect. This is how it works. You take a minority, whatever it may be, and the minorities change all around the world, of course. Who's the minority, majority? And the minority then looks for a majority that's oppressing it. And so the majority, whatever the majority is, in whatever situation, cannot be politically correct against the minority, and the minority cannot be politically incorrect against the majority. And this was highlighted in a single quote. There's a lady who was the student diversity officer at Goldsmiths, part of the University of London, I think. Her name was Bahar Mustafa. Now, this lady hit the headlines by, as a diversity officer, trying to ban men and white people from a meeting about equality and diversity. I kid you not. And when challenged on this inversion. She said, I can't be racist or sexist because I am an ethnic minority woman. This is the self-delusion that we're dealing with. That it's not about fairness, justice, equality. I'm all for that. Equality, justice, fairness for white males, for minority women, for gays, all of them. Why should we not have fairness, justice, and equality for all? But that's not what this is about. And that quote is a classic. They don't want equality. They want tyranny, where whatever the minority is in a certain situation, they have control over the majority. They'll never see that because they're stupid, but that's what's happening. And let's get across this myth that majorities always impose themselves on minorities. It's not true. You look at through history and you'll see how many times minorities have imposed themselves on majorities, whatever the majority was. Look at apartheid South Africa. Small white minority imposed its will on the black majority for decades and decades and decades. But political correctness cannot survive unless it sees the world completely, symbolically and literally, in terms of black and white. And one of the other major concepts of Orwell in 1984, I mentioned it already, was what I call the inversion. He talked about war is peace, and freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Well, in terms of political correctness, it talks about, and its childlike advocates talk about, diversity. That lady called a diversity officer. But what they're actually doing is destroying diversity in the name of diversity. What diversity can you have when you have a gathering campaign to silence anything that challenges the politically correct norm? What's that got to do with diversity? It's destroying it. Of course it is. It's what it's meant to do. And then you talk about tolerance, or they talk about tolerance. And if there are more intolerant people on planet Earth than the politically correctness extremists, well, I have met them. Anything you say that's slightly out of order, and they're on the internet, they're on the media, screaming abuse and outrage. Here's a great quote that sums up political correctness and its inverted diversity, by a guy called Jacques Bazin, a French-born American historian. And he described it like this: political correctness does not legislate tolerance, it organizes hatred. And so you have people who are talking about hate speech and condemning people for upsetting someone or other, and they do it with absolute hatred and intolerance. They're being played like a stringed instrument and they can't see it. And this whole labeling people has been going on for a while. It's just expanding. I mean, you know, all the way since the creation of Israel. If you challenge Israel, you're anti-Semitic. It actually doesn't mean anti-Jewish, funnily enough, if you look deeply into the real meaning of what anti-Semitic means, but that's another story. It doesn't mean you're anti-Jewish to challenge Israel. It means you're anti Palestinians being bombed from the air to death and destruction, and what goes on in the occupied territories and Israel in general in regard to Palestinians. Challenge that, and you are a racist, you are politically incorrect. And that's what is now being expanded across the whole spectrum of society. Ways to silence genuine dissent and justified criticism through this politically correct nonsense. And it's also about divide and rule. If we came from the concept that we are all one consciousness having different experiences, then that from its very foundation is based on unity. Diversity of expression of one infinite awareness. The more labels you invent, the more potential there is for playing those labels off against each other. And that's what is happening. And so the different labels who self-identify with their sexuality, their race, their whatever, their religion, the different labels often don't get upset by what people say and opinions people have. There's so many things in relation to what's called Islamophobia and politically correct condemnation and calling it Islamophobia, when most people from the Muslim perspective are going, "Couldn't care less, mate, what's the problem?" But political correctness makes it a problem. And part of that is telling these different labels that they should be upset. They have to be upset because political correctness needs upset people. Otherwise it can't function. And so what you're doing is you're removing the concept of this. For those extreme advocates of political correctness, this is called a backbone. And we all have one. It's just that some political correct advocates and those who believe the bollocks have forgotten. And political correctness doesn't want you to have one of these. It wants you to be like a jelly that's upset by anything. We had a situation in an American university recently where students were offered counselling for seeing a sticker of a Confederate flag on someone's laptop. This is where we're going. And what does the state want to control the population? Let's get down to bloody basics here. It wants childlike people who are easily upset and want the state to protect them from whatever the latest manufactured upset may be. Now there is racism, there is homophobia, there is a bias and prejudice against people of different types, including prejudice by some politically correct groups against white males. But this is not about that. This is about manufacturing apparent prejudice so that political correctness can expand and expand its tyranny. And this is something it's worth having. It does help. I mean, they should have been in my shoes the last 25 years. The constant abuse and ridicule that continues. Why am I still going after all these years, despite all this ridicule, all this condemnation, all this abuse? Well, A, I've got one of them. And B, what idiots say about me is irrelevant because they're idiots. And I get on with my life. Have you seen what that Tyson Fury said about gays and women? Yeah, idiot. What's going to tell you tonight? Political correctness couldn't survive in that atmosphere. It needs upset. And if it's not really there, then they must make it up. This whole political correctness as well, just like global warming, that nonsense, is driven to a large extent by money. The amount of people now that are employed to police political correctness. This is a list of some of the politically correct positions at the University of California in San Diego alone. They have an Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Equity, Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Inversion, Staff Diversity Liaison, Graduate Student Diversity Liaison, Undergraduate Student Diversity Liaison, Chief Diversity Officer, Director of Development for Diversity Initiatives, Director of the Cross-Cultural Centre, Director of the Women's Centre, Director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Resource Centre. How did we ever get by with all that, without all that before? It's another engineered transformation of human society to bring about the end that all these engineered situations want to bring about. The total control of the human race at every level, down to the very thoughts we have, the very opinions that we speak. And it's not only, if I can find it here, it's not only politically correct extremists that need one of them. It's those who bow to their tyranny. You'll notice how many times famous people are targeted. Because when you target famous people, because of its high profile, what that's basically saying is, see what happens if you go outside political correctness. This is what happens to you. And I have to say, you see the grotesque and pathetic side of someone in the public eye saying something very mild and without wishing to upset anybody, but they don't use quite the right language according to political correctness. And the next thing you know, there's the furor going on. And it's in the papers, he said this, and people on the internet are saying this about him or her. And then you get the pathetic side, as I was saying, of the famous person almost begging for forgiveness. Oh, I didn't really mean what they're saying it meant. And all that. Why not just say, I have a right to my opinion. I have a right to express myself as I see fit. I was not trying to upset anybody. I was just giving an opinion. So, political correctness people and all the abusers, piss off. Get a life. Grow up. Go beyond the terrible twos you seem to be stuck in. And look around the world and see what really needs challenging while you go about your self-obsession and your arrogance in dictating what other people can say and think. And if anyone now, as a result of what I've said, wants to start trolling me, feel free. Don't give a shit. Now, let's get into some detail on the background of this, because there are some extraordinary stories that are almost becoming commonplace. Let's start with Newspeak. Newspeak, this is a description of Newspeak, or was Newspeak. It's a fictional language, which it was, not anymore, in the novel 1984. It's a controlled language created by the totalitarian state of Oceania as a tool to limit freedom of thought and concepts that pose a threat to the regime, such as freedom, self-expression, individuality, and peace. All of which are the targets of political correctness. Any form of thought alternative to the party's construct is classified as a thought crime. What are we dealing with political correctness other than thought crime and speak crime? Opinions become a crime. Let's just let that kind of fester for a bit. Opinions become a crime. That's the kind of society we're being pushed into by these morons. The aim of Newspeak is to remove all shades of meaning from language, leaving simple concepts, pleasure and pain, happiness and sadness, good think and crime think, that reinforce the total dominance of the state. Newspeak root words serve as both nouns and verbs, further reducing the total number of words. For example, think is both a noun and a verb, so the word thought is not required and can be abolished. The party also intends that Newspeak be spoken in staccato rhythms with syllables that are easy to pronounce. Text speak is part of that. This will make speech more automatic and unconscious, which is what they want us to be, and reduce the likelihood of thought. In addition, words with negative meanings are removed as redundant, so bad becomes ungood. Words with comparative and superlative meanings are also simplified, so better becomes gooder and best becomes goodest. Intensifiers can be added, so great becomes plus good, and excellent or splendid becomes double plus good. This ambiguity between comparative superlative forms and intensified forms is one of the few examples of ambiguity in Newspeak. Adjectives are formed by adding the suffix full to the root word, so good thinkful, orthodox in thought, and adverbs by adding wise, good think wise, in an orthodox manner. This would, of course, not prevent heretical statements such as Big Brother is ungood, but not only would this statement sound absurd in the ears of the politically orthodox, it would also be impossible to elaborate on or specify exactly what the statement means, since all concepts and words that can be used to argue against Big Brother, i.e. liberty, rights, freedom, etc., would be eradicated from the language. The statement would thus be meaningless. So when you apply this to political correctness and the way that the world's being pushed, that is exactly what Orwell envisaged with regards to Newspeak. According to Orwell, the purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of the system, but to make other modes of thought impossible. Its vocabulary was so constructed as to give exact and often very subtle expression to every meaning that a party member could properly wish to express, while excluding all other meaning and also the possibility of arriving at them by indirect methods. This was done partly by the invention of new words, but chiefly by eliminating undesirable words and stripping such words as remained of orthodox meanings, and so far as possible of all secondary meaning whatsoever. The idea that language influences worldview is linguistic relativity. For example, the word free still existed in Newspeak, but could only be used in terms of something not being possessed, as in the dog is free from lice or this field is free from weeds. It could not be used in terms of being able to do as one pleases, as in free choice or free will, since these concepts no longer existed. And if you look at the politically correct zealots, because it's just another religion to these people, then they are doing exactly that. They are destroying the choice of opinion, for a start. Newspeak was designed not to extend, but to diminish the range of thought, and this purpose was indirectly assisted by cutting the choices of words down to a minimum. Any redundancies in the English language were removed. As Orwell further states, by 2050, and even these dates are there or thereabouts in terms of the real thing. In fact, he's probably being optimistic, 2050. By 2050, earlier probably, yes, all real knowledge of old speak, the old language, will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, they'll exist only in Newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually contradictory of what they used to be. Even the literature of the party will change. Even the slogans will change. How could you have a slogan like "freedom is slavery" when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climax of thought will be different. Climate rather of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought. It's the point I made earlier, as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. That is what politically correctness is all about and where it's leading. These people that are the zealots of it, they're all unconscious. Otherwise they wouldn't talk the crap they do. In Orwell's novel, Newspeak attempts to influence thought by consolidating, i.e. decreasing, the expressiveness of the English language. And there's a Newspeak word called bellyfeel. And bellyfeel refers to a blind, enthusiastic acceptance of an idea, unconscious acceptance without question. There's crime think. That's the Newspeak word for thought crime, thoughts that are unorthodox or outside the official government platform, as well as the verb meaning to commit thought crime. Good think, which is improved by the party, is the opposite of crime think. Winston Smith, the main character, writes in his diary, "Thought crime does not entail death, thought crime is death." Then there's a lovely Newspeak word called duck speak. See if you recognize this in today's world. Duck speak is a Newspeak term meaning to quack like a duck, or to speak without thinking. Duck speak can be good or ungood, bad to you and me, depending on who is speaking and whether what they are saying aligns with Big Brother's ideals. To speak rubbish and lies may be ungood, but to do so for the good of the party may be good. Orwell explains in the appendix, ultimately it was hoped to make articulate speech issue from the larynx without involving the higher brain centers. Exactly. That's what's happening. That's what these people are doing. It's what more and more people are doing. This aim was frankly admitted in the Newspeak word duckspeak. Like various words in the B vocabulary of Newspeak, duckspeak was ambivalent in meaning, providing that the opinions which were quacked out were orthodox ones. It implied nothing but praise. And when the Times referred to one of the orators of the party as a double plus good duck speaker, it was paying a warm and valued compliment. This may seem fantastic on the face of it, but look at all these politically correct words and phrases that are coming into wider use, just down this same road. An example of duckspeak in action is provided in chapter 9 when the inner party speaker is haranguing the crowd about crimes of Eurasia when a note is passed into his hand. He never stops speaking or changes his inflection, but according to the Change Party position, he now condemns the crimes of Eastasia, which is Oceania's new enemy. And you see this, where at one time this country or this leader is the friend of the West, and then the next thing they're bombing him because he's a tyrant. Own life. Own life refers to the tendency to enjoy being solitary or individualistic, which is considered subversive. Winston Smith comments that even to go for a walk by oneself can be regarded as suspicious. Now look at the things now. The list is getting longer and longer of what people are told to look for as suspicious activity in relation to reporting people to the police as possible terrorists. And one of them is people that spend a lot of time alone. Unperson. An unperson is someone who has been vaporized, not only killed by the state, but erased from existence. When you make information, or the whole basis of information, the electronic internet, then you don't even have to take books out of circulation to make someone disappear from public consciousness. You can do it with click, click, enter, delete button. The idea is that such a person would be written out of existing books, photographs, and articles, so that no trace of their existence could be found in the historical record. The idea is that such a person would, according to the principles of doublethink, be forgotten completely, for it would be impossible to provide evidence of their existence, even by close friends and family. Mentioning his name and even speaking of his past existence is thought crime. The concept that the person may have existed at one time and has disappeared cannot be expressed in Newspeak. And there's another word there, Newspeak word, doublethink. Doublethink is the ability to hold two contradicting beliefs at the same time and not see the contradiction between them. This is the politically correct mafia talking about diversity and tolerance while destroying diversity and being extraordinarily intolerant. And ramifications of Newspeak. The advantages of Newspeak are its means of preserving the secrets of the party, preventing politically motivated actions, and promoting the use of politically correct terms. Its disadvantages include the party using censorship and glamorization of themselves, compromised freedom of speech, and the prevention of the flow of ideas for the citizens of Oceania who are controlled by this reduction in their language. And finally, it talks here about Newspeak. This is the so important aspect of it that's often missed, as I mentioned before. Limiting language limits more than just words, it limits thought. Without the means to express thoughts beyond I feel good or ungood, people lack the means to commit a thought crime. Even if it were committed, it is unlikely that people would understand enough to take action. Free speech diminishes as the dictionary slims down with each new edition. There is not much difference between this action and reducing the population that could actually read the word dictionary if the book were placed in front of them. Without the ability to read or write, one is unaware of the concept of free speech and unable to know how to prevent its erosion. And then we come to this, which is, I've mentioned this lady already, but Goldsmith student diversity officer Bahar Mustafa, I can't be racist or sexist because I'm an ethnic minority woman. The student diversity officer of a Goldsmiths University has said she cannot be racist or sexist because she is an ethnic minority woman. She made comments as part of a statement defending trying to ban men and white people from a diversity and equality event. She says that there have been charges made against me that I am racist and sexist to white men. I want to explain that why this is false. I, an ethnic minority woman, cannot be racist or sexist to white men because racism and sexism describe structures of privilege based on race and gender. How about the privilege to silence people because you don't like what they're saying? And therefore, women of colour and non-binary genders cannot be racist or sexist, as we do not stand to benefit from such a system. Absolute rubbish. But they're too stupid to see what they're doing and why it's being done. Millennials want USA to be North Korea. 40% say offensive speech should be criminalized by the government. This is becoming more and more obvious that large numbers of young people who have been brought up into this culture from the start, and therefore they know nothing else, are being manipulated to support their own enslavement and their own imprisonment. And those that are not falling for that are abused and bullied into silence by these characters I'm talking about. Political correctness, like I say, has been manipulated totalitarian tiptoe style, bit by bit, over a long period. It's just now reached a point of power and influence that it's moving quicker and quicker and quicker. And like I say, lots of people in these minorities I think it's a load of rubbish as much as I do. But that don't matter. They don't matter. Only those that go with it matter. We have a black presenter on an MTV video condemning Halloween and other children's costumes as racist. And he said that he hoped anyone buying a Confederate uniform for their kids gets into a car accident and have to be saved by black paramedics. Now, he has a right to that opinion. But if he was a white guy saying white paramedics, he'd probably be arrested and in court. This is what I mean. It's not about diversity and justice and fairness and equality. I'm all for that. It's the opposite, but they can't see it because they're up their own arse. There's this other story here. There's an organisation called Coexist House. It's a US and UK based interfaith group. And it's called on employers to ban ham sandwiches and sausage rolls on the grounds that Muslims and Jews might find them offensive. What about someone like me that might find the concept of that offensive? It doesn't matter, because it's not politically correct. There's a politically correct offensive, and then there's non-politically correct offensive, and that doesn't matter. Coexist House, a guy called Andy Dinham, a University of London professor who wrote the guidelines, he said, it would be good etiquette to avoid heating up foods that might be prohibited for people of other faiths. We also say don't put kosher or halal and other special foods next to another food, or God forbid, on the same plate. But how halal and kosher foods and animals are killed, that's irrelevant. Can't challenge that. It might upset a minority. Eva Brun, a bishop in Sweden, has said that Christian crosses should be removed from Swedish churches in deference to Muslims, and churches should provide Muslim prayer rooms. Why not ban the Bible? Go the old way. I mean, I don't care for any religion, but this is all taking the whole idea of diversity again on its head. You want to follow the Christian religion, you want to follow the Muslim religion, well, just go ahead. Oh no, we must basically fuse them together. Destroying diversity. Just one example, just endless destruction of diversity because of this whole scam. And we have a situation, I mean, it had to get here in the end, where the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee announced that the term politically correct is now politically incorrect. Apparently, it is a microaggression. Classic newspeak. A microaggression because it suggests that people are being too sensitive and are policing the language. They are. Truth matters not to PC. I better, I'll say 3 Hail Mustafas and move on. Then there's the money in the madness. And, you know, you see the film The Life of Brian. And the money in the madness, of course, is all this diversity hierarchy that you find everywhere. And of course, those in the Jewish community who get their money from donations to protect the Jewish community from racism, what do they depend on to keep the money flowing? The perception of racism against Jewish people. So it's an industry. You never see anywhere, anytime, one of these Jewish organizations that is self-styled, self-created to protect the Jewish community from racism. You never ever hear them anytime, anywhere say, well, actually, racism against Jewish people is falling. You know, even if it is, you never hear it. Why? Because the money will stop flowing to protect them against what they've been manipulated to believe is the case. But back to The Life of Brian. There was a lovely scene in it. I think it's a brilliant movie. There's a lovely scene in it where Stan announces that he wants to be known as a woman called Loretta, and he wants to have babies. And this was this is classic politically correctness. It's just so brilliant. Stan, I want to be a woman from now on. I want you to call me Loretta. Reg, what? It's my right as a man. Judith, well, why do you want to be Loretta, Stan? I want to have babies. Reg, played by John Cleese. You want to have babies? It's every man's right to have babies if he wants them. But you can't have babies. Don't oppress me. Classic. Oh, do you know, we've reached the point where you cannot be comedic about political correctness because it's far beyond anything that you could invent. Reg, I'm not oppressing you, Stan. You haven't got a womb. Where's the fetus going to gestate? You got to keep it in a box? Stan, sniff. Judith, here, I've got an idea. Suppose you agree that he can't actually have babies, not having a womb, which is nobody's fault, not even the Romans, but that he can have the right to have babies. Rogers, good idea, Judith. We shall fight the oppressors for your right to have babies, brother, sister, sorry. Reg, what's the point? What? What's the point of fighting for his right to have babies when he can't have babies? Rogers, it is symbolic of our struggle against oppression. Reg, symbolic of his struggle against reality. In that one scene, it just encapsulates what we're dealing with in the so-called real world. Now, this is a brilliant article by a man called Professor Frank Furedi, and it's headed "Death of Free Speech," as Germaine Greer is branded transphobic by student feminists whose trail she blazed. A top academic attacks the self-righteous zealots, censoring history and literature and crushing debate in our universities. Again, more systematic. It's a great article. And he starts. Germaine Greer has spent a lifetime caught in controversy in her relentless and often provocative battle to advance women's rights. But now it is the high priestess of feminism herself who has been accused of betraying women, because it's all gone on to another level. Lots of the things that Germaine Greer and the people of that period were saying were absolutely right, and they're still not as they should be. But this lot have gone into the stratosphere of the nonsensical. Greer said she was pulling out of giving a lecture at Cardiff University after female students there branded her transphobic and lobbied for her to be banned. What had the 76-year-old professor done to warrant this fury? She had once expressed the opinion that even if a man had himself castrated, he would not look, sound, or behave like a woman. He also said that she also said that a great many women think male to female transgender people do not look, sound, or behave like women. Do you know, they're trying to ban the term in the United States, pregnant woman, because they say that not all women have wombs. Oh, the fairies. Look, there's fairies everywhere. This saga involving Germaine Greer and others, says Furedi. These sagas highlighted the increasingly totalitarian attitudes of our university campuses, the bullying dressed up as tolerance, the obsession with political correctness and identity, the pretentious, overblown language and the eagerness to portray as many as possible as victims. What does the state want? People in the mode of being a victim, because they're easily controllable. How bitterly ironic, he says, that this pernicious culture has led to Germaine Greer, who has dedicated her academic life to fighting for women's voices to be heard in society, having her voice silenced by feminist students. This new censorship is spreading like a cancer across British universities and elsewhere, not least in North America, imposing ever greater heavy-handed restrictions on what can be said or read. And C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under a robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies." He goes on, "That is a good description of what is now happening in parts of our academic system. For the censorship is increasingly imposed in the name of keeping students safe and guarding them from anything that might possibly offend what are regarded as their vulnerable minds." Backbone. Potentially, the results to society as a whole are profoundly dangerous. Whereas Britain's liberal democracy once allowed for, even encouraged, the open exchange of thoughts and ideas, this new dogma demands only the narrowest worldview and nothing less than the suppression of free speech. It is a movement that can be seen to operate through two distinct processes, he says. One is the campaigners' claim that universities should be so-called safe spaces where no one upsets anybody and therefore says anything worth hearing, free from any views that students might consider offensive. And all those students will have different things that they've chosen to be offended by, so what can be said that won't offend anyone? This attitude leads to bans being imposed on speakers who are deemed to have contravened through their views, past statements or other arbitrary factors the current code of politically correct behaviour. As a result, student bodies have become the new Cromwellians, rooting out anyone regarded as heretical in their thinking against the new credo. The second, equally sinister practice is the introduction of so-called trigger warnings. If you're not coming across this, well, you know, have a load of this. Trigger warnings being inserted into books and texts. These alerts are designed to shield students from inadvertently being exposed to material which might, it is argued in this new atmosphere of political correctness, unsettle or even traumatize them. He says, "I would argue that it is this fixation with safe spaces and trigger warnings that is helping to erode the traditional liberal ethos of the universities." Yes, and destroy the whole perception mechanisms of students, generation after generation. In place of openness, there is now internal policing of thoughts and words. Sadly, these age-old principles of challenging and debate are being replaced by the new censors. For instance, the radical feminist Julie Bindel has banned recently, or was banned recently, from speaking at the University of Manchester by the Students' Union there on the grounds that some articles she had written about transsexuality were offensive. In 2004, she wrote in The Guardian, "I don't have a problem with men disposing of their genitals, but it does not make them women in the same way that shoving a bit of vacuum hose down your 501s, jeans, I understand, I'm getting old, does not make you a man." Bindel has also written online, "Can those of us who hate bullying please do something about the trans cabal running a witch hunt every time they get offended?" Shamefully, the University of Manchester authorities did nothing to stop this outrageous act of authoritarianism. Why? Because they're also terrified of political correctness, and as an arm of the state anyway, political correctness is what is required to be imposed. In similar vein, the University of Warwick recently stood lamely by when its Students' Union barred Iranian human rights campaigner Maram Namazi, who speaks out against Sharia law, from speaking to a campus secular group. Her talk had to be blocked, said the Students' Union, because her long-standing opposition to Islamic theocracy undermined, quote, the right of Muslim students not to feel intimidated or discriminated against on the university campus. See, this is a major point. These politically correct zealots and dictators, they will go overboard, is not the word, in their hatred and their intolerance and their abuse against the most mild things that are said. But when faced with something that really matters, like the treatment of women by Sharia law, then they have nothing to say because they get confused, because they are bewildered. Well, minorities can't be wrong. So there's a minority, this lady challenging the treatment of women by Islam. But she's a minority within a minority. So if we don't oppose her, then we're going to upset this other minority. Never mind that minority is suppressing and oppressing her. So they walk away from it. It's mental illness. No other word for it. This absurd decision, the writer says, not only made a complete mockery of free speech, but was also an inversion of morality. That word again. Inversion, inversion, inversion. That's what the system does. The real intimidation surely comes not from Ms. Namazi, but from Islamic religious hardliners and their sympathizers who refuse to accept any challenge to their bigotry. But there may be bigots. But in this area of the world, there are a minority of bigots, and therefore political correctness must protect them from challenge, exposing them as bigots, even though a woman's involved. And did I say mental illness? As Ms. Namazi, a refugee from the tyrannical Iranian regime, put it, if I can't criticize Islam, that leaves me very few options as a dissenter, because the only thing I have is my freedom of expression. If anyone is inciting hatred, it is the Islamists who are threatening people like me just because we don't want to toe the line. What does she say? That leaves me with very few options as a dissenter, because the only thing I have is my freedom of expression. That's why they want to take it away. Like I said earlier, this is nothing about stopping racism and sexism and homophobia. It doesn't do with that. As we see with a woman, an oppressed woman in the Islamic world. After an inevitable public outcry, Warwick Students' Union grudgingly reinstated the invitation to Ms. Namazi, but the knee-jerk impulse to shut down debate remains. The writer says, as I found in researching my new book, The Power of Reading, From Socrates to Twitter, it is the same story with these so-called trigger warnings. An idea that originated in the US, this is where political correctness came from, and has come out of, because I mentioned earlier the Frankfurt School that started in Frankfurt, Germany, hence the name, and the Rothschilds were fundamentally involved in its creation. It then moved different parts until it ended up in California, where political correctness, of course, came out of. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. And which meant that students would be warned about any words or images that could disturb them under this new moral code. This does not include extreme material, even great works, or doesn't just include extreme material. Even great works of literature can be subject to trigger warnings from these self-appointed guardians of our morals. One undergraduate at Rutgers University in New Jersey, in the same vein, recently called for warnings to be issued about Virginia Woolf's 1925 classic, Mrs. Dalloway, which involves a character committing suicide, because it could spark painful memories for students suffering from self-harm. There'll be nothing left but breathing in the end. And for many, not even that, if we let this go on. Meanwhile, there was also a call for F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, one of the finest novels of the 20th century, to be accompanied by warnings that it contained scenes of suicide, domestic abuse, and graphic violence. What is really disturbing, the writer says, is that all too often American university authorities are keen to comply with this censorship of free speech for the reasons that I have mentioned. Official guidelines at Oberlin College in Ohio warned its lecturers, be aware of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, cisism, prejudice against transgendered people apparently. Hope you're keeping up. Ableism, discrimination favouring able-bodied people, and other issues of privilege and oppression. The college even suggests the removal of what it calls triggering material unless it is essential to learning. Now, this is all about taking out of books and changing them into newspeak books, which is what Orwell talked about. Orwell was not coming from his imagination in its foundation themes, but from insider knowledge. He's trying to warn people. Last month, a study published by the National Union of Students stated, this report carries a trigger warning for discussions of sexual assault and rape. They're students. You know, you read about these things and you learn about these things. Trigger warnings. Why didn't we need them before? Trigger warnings in a student document. It's the playground. The report's almost casually routine use of the new jargon term trigger warning indicates how it has been seamlessly integrated into current campus culture. This is certainly true of Goldsmiths College in London, where during a recent occupation, students demanded trigger warnings must be regular practice at lectures and seminars. Again, all too many British university authorities, instead of standing up for free speech and challenging this warped thinking, give in to this hectoring totalitarianism. At Durham University, a circular issued to arts and humanities lecturers indicated that they would have to gain approval from an ethics committee if they wished to offer lectures and tutorials on different topics that might offend students, such as abortion and euthanasia. What is so depressing is that this demand for trigger warnings comes not from the institutions, this is a key, but from the students themselves. We are having not a whole generation, because there are still lots of young people in control of their own minds, but a significant and growing number of young people. They are growing up, wrong use of the term really, they are getting older but not growing up, and they're staying childlike into their teenage years and onwards. And these will become the decision makers and people in positions of influence and power in the not too distant future. Again, all too many British university authorities, as I said, are giving into this thinking because it's all part of the. It's also all part of the plan. In the past, it was the other way round. Censorship was imposed by authorities, while those demanding further crackdowns, such as a TV cleanup campaign of Mary Whitehouse, were widely seen as prudes and reactionaries. In fighting for greater freedoms, student activists in the 60s and the 70s were among the biggest rebels against traditional values of conservatism. Now it's changed. Now the students are demanding their own enslavement and the enslavement of other people. That's how far the program has now imposed itself upon the thinking of the institutions. And of course, look, I talked about it so many times. You come out of the womb, and in next to no time, you're in the school system, and then you're in the college system, university system. They've had control of these kids' minds all these years, and look what they've turned out, on purpose. That's what it's about. And if we're talking about this generation being like that, or large numbers of them, what's the generation coming after going to be like? Unless we stand up and have some backbone. It should go without saying that this drive for censorship is highly dangerous, not just because it is an attack on basic freedoms, but also because it infantilizes students, enfeebling their minds while inflating their egos. It's the me syndrome without brains to perceive what's happening and why. Indeed, much of this is, I believe, a childish form of narcissism, with some students, like oversized toddlers, eager to draw attention to themselves by making a drama of something unacceptable in their studies. It's a kind of attention-seeking self-indulgence, using a self-diagnosis of vulnerability as a vehicle for parading one's championing of victimhood and thereby gaining social status. Defining oneself by defining oneself as a victim. Do you think those people will be easy to control and direct? I think there might be a chance. Is if, as some activists at the University of California claimed recently, certain lectures could trigger the onset of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, then those students affected really would have lost all sense of perspective and resilience. Many of them have. And it must be a nightmare for those students working in this atmosphere who've still got control of their own minds. I would go further and say that some of those bleating about the need for warnings have shown that they are unfit for their chosen professions. At Harvard last year, some students on a law course complained that lectures about the legal status of rape covered ground that was considered unacceptable to them. As the writer said, one student even argued that the very use of the word violate was traumatizing. How on earth, I wonder, he says, would she cope with real victims of crime as a lawyer? It is utterly absurd, he says, to pretend that students can be wrapped in cocoons and be protected from the truth, but that is exactly what some universities are doing with their pathetic talk of safe spaces, free of anything offensive. In fact, some educational institutions have given physical manifestations to this infantilized concept of the so-called self space or safe space. At the university, Brown University, in the Ivy League university in the US, there is a special room set aside for students who feel they have been triggered that contains, wait for it, cookies, Play-Doh, and videos of puppies. The idea is to keep people in childhood so they don't grow up into fully mature adults. And it's working. For many people, anyway. There is no way to equip young people for the adult world doing this. What's more, my fear is that this kind of thinking will soon leach insidiously outwards, both into schools and the wider society. That's exactly what it's meant to do. Universities should be intellectually challenging, not lazily comforting. In particular, reading and thinking should be demanding tasks. That is why the great canon of Western literature is so powerful, precisely because it does contain elements that are thought-provoking, heart-rending, and disturbing. The 17th century English poet John Milton believed that readers possessed a fundamental capacity to judge, endowing them with importance and dignity. However, that respect for individual freedom and judgment is just what these modern censors refuse to accept. When feminists start to attack Germaine Greer, you know that we really are living in a topsy-turvy world. So, when you look at George Orwell's book 1984, it's clear that he was predicting the future, not writing a novel. And newspeak is massively important in the range of concepts and themes that the book exposes. It's even more important than things like telescreens, because there is a fundamental difference between something recording what you say and you not saying it at all, which is why newspeak is so insidious, so crucial to understand, and why political correctness can be seen as another name for newspeak. Backbone. Face the world. Look it in the eye. And look these trolls and tyrannical people from the PC madhouse in the eye. You don't like what I say? PC people? Too freaking bad. Because I'm going to go on saying it. See you next week.